Hey everybody, I'm Anna McEwen. And now for Bob Switzer with the epic narrative.
Well, come back. I didn't know how to start that. Actually, got jammed up halfway through my my welcoming. So we're in chapter 2 of the book of Joshua. Really appreciate everybody hanging out here at the epic narrative and getting into the story. I think that there's a lot of shifts in my position on who Joshua is and was as I studied this book. As you know from the last couple of weeks, I think he just adopted what was, I guess you could say, culturally acceptable for the plan to take on the promised land. I think that he got it from Moses. I think it made sense to him as a man, as a military person. I'm sure it also resonated with the other elders of the community. It just, I just don't think God's plan is to kill people. So that being said, I think we'll see another little shift here today. One that kind of, again, I didn't necessarily see coming. And once I filtered it, I was like, oh my gosh, that makes, like, of course. So here we are in Joshua chapter 2, verse 1. Then Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim. I know that's a that's a fun word to say in church, you know, if you ever want to preach or have fun in a junior high Sunday school class. Anyways, go look over the land, he said, especially Jericho. So they went, they entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. And we're gonna stop there. So here we have Joshua sending 2 spies, a recon mission. He's like, I want you to go check things out, especially Jericho. Now, this is normal, right? This is normal pre-battle plan, obtaining of information. This is normal procedure, nothing unusual. Joshua plans on doing battle. He plans on doing a lot of battles, and based on where they're going to be encamping, they're going to be right across the river from Jericho. Jericho makes sense to be the first, the first battle. So Jericho, just for what it's worth, Jericho probably has sent people to do the same thing, right? They want to know about this incredibly large group of nomads that had defeated a couple kings and had set up camp for the last year or two across the river. What were their plans? And I'm sure that they heard from people in the Israeli camp, in the Hebrew camp. They heard about how God had promised them this land where, of course, the Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, anyways, a lot of other tribes. How can I not say? I'm looking at the word, can't say the word. They knew, like, they were getting information over the last couple of years that eventually that this massive amount of tribes, these 12 tribes, were going to move into their land. And I'm sure that they heard that it would, that they plan on doing battle, that they plan on waging war, that they plan on taking the land, that there was some sort of level of aggression that I'm sure that everyday Hebrews would have had in their vocabulary when they're talking to people from the promised land. And whether they did it on purpose or not, I don't know. I don't know if Jericho purposely sent spies or if they just used information that they would pick up from merchants. Because, of course, merchants were doing business with the Hebrews. And they would also cross the river, whether by boat or ferry. If I'm sure that there were ferries that went across in various places, and they would do business on both sides of the river, and they would pass information along, and they would talk about this culture of a one God, that they didn't have multiple gods, that most people over there didn't have a ton of idols, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 in their tents. They only had one, and they worshiped him and they sacrificed to him, but they've never done a human sacrifice. It's not something that they do, and and that the priests teach the people throughout the land. Like they would have known, Jericho would have known a lot about this culture and about these people that are standing on the other side of the river. Now Jericho, just for what it's worth, Jericho is considered one of the oldest continuous settlements in history. That was fascinating to me. It began small, like a trading village, at about 9,000 before Christ, and although it shifted focuses and occupants throughout that time, about every 1,000 years, according to archaeology, about every 1,000 years there was a different tribe would take it over, and it would sometimes expand and sometimes it would shrink, but it always existed. It was always there, and we'll get into a little bit more later. But around 4,000 BC, it became more urban. All right, that's when they believe the first walls were built, around 4,000 BC. The Amorites are given credit for that, and they probably were there till about 2400 BC, and that's when the Canaanites took over, about 1900 BC. And in between, it wasn't like there were battles to take over the city. It just became culturally overrun with a different tribe, and eventually that tribe became the dominant tribe, and now that the city belonged to them, so to speak. It wasn't like massive battles all the time. So the Canaanites take over about 1900 BC. Joshua arrives about 1400 BC. So in essence, the Canaanites have been there for about 500 years. So the whole time the Hebrews are in Egypt, the Canaanites have been in Jericho, even before that. But we'll just keep it kind of simple for our listeners. Not that you guys need it simple. Generally speaking, the Hebrews, have the whole time the Hebrews have been gone, the Canaanites have been in Jericho. Now, historically, they would have been aware of Jacob. They would have been aware of the 12 sons. They would have been aware of this move of the family down to Egypt some 400 years ago. And I'm not saying that they studied it, but they would have been aware of it, because if you remember, Abraham was, massively wealthy. And then, of course, the family continued to amass wealth and gain influence in the area. And then, of course, there's that massive famine, and Joseph ends up in Egypt and eventually becomes a ruler down there. And, and then this family packs up and moves to Egypt, which, of course, during a famine makes sense. A lot of people did that. A lot of wealthy people would do that in order to survive. But it was always, from, if you listen to season 2, I don't think Jacob was ever designed to stay down there. And yet he did. And I understand why. We go into that in detail, but, with the work that Joseph was able to give them, and the influence and the wealth that they were able to give them, and a beautiful place to live. They didn't have to, continue to be whatever they were up in the promised land. Anyways, they made choices to stay there, and ultimately, as you know, turned into a immigrant nation. They had nowhere to go. Egypt took advantage of that. They offered them protection, and they offered them, places to live, but they had to give up their freedom and give up their wealth, and ultimately they became slaves to the nation of Egypt. But that progression didn't happen overnight. So here we are 500 years later, 400 years later, and that story would have still been a part of the history of the land that the Canaanites were a part of. So they, I'm sure, had some sort of, when the Hebrews moved to the other side of the river, just out on the other side of Jericho, and they were, took over, defeated a couple kings and took over that parcel of land. I'm sure at some level they were like, who are these people again? Oh yeah, oh, I remember that old story. And those stories started to resurface. And I bring all that up because to me, that's part of what's going on here. So many times we get a surgical view of what happened at Jericho. And all we hear is that, well, the Canaanites are evil people and needed to die. And Jericho was a massive city and needed to be destroyed. So, that's what happened. But Jericho's been around for a long, long time. And I've read a lot of archaeologists, not plans, what are the reports from, and they see that Jericho's been around a long time. And a lot of them are like, well, the walls never came down, or only portions of it came down, or it moved. There was a time where it actually moved. It shifted down the river a little bit. And that was another, it's still called Jericho, but it's not in the same place as the other Jericho. There's a lot of history when you have 9,000 years of the same city. There's going to be a lot of stuff to dig up and a lot of stories to tell. So these stories would have been a part of that, and they were probably renewed or remembered, especially in the last year or two as this culture moved in across the river. And so when the king is brought information of the spies, right? They show up, and in verse 1, all we see is that go over to the land, he said, especially Jericho. So they went and they entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. Verse 2, the king of Jericho was told, look, some Israelite spies have come tonight to spy out our land. Now, I'm not going to go deep into that, but he's told, hey, these guys are here to spy out the land. So I don't know how that comes out. I don't know how that information gets so clear. Because these guys were, evidently they didn't try to be too incognito, but they were recognized. And I don't know if it was the shoes they wore or the belt that they had on, but it wasn't just a merchant from the Hebrew nation across the river. These two guys were clearly here to do some spying. They were here to do some recon. This nation is preparing. Remember, at the end of chapter 1, or at the beginning of chapter 1, we saw that the announcement went out that be prepared to move. You have 3 days to prepare yourself to move. So I don't know when these spies were set out, because we'll find out next week that it took more than 3 days for them to do their journey. So they were probably, I'm thinking they were either sent out and the people were given 3 days to get ready to move, but they didn't know when they were going to move. So in essence, that to me makes the most sense. The people were told, listen, you got 3 days to pack up. We are moving. We don't know exactly when, but you need to be ready to go. And that would have made sense, right? I probably spent too much time on last week. Bob's like, you really did. It takes a while to get your house ready to go. Even if you're on wheels, you have to prepare all kinds of stuff. So, I think, Joshua gives them that time and says in 3 days, be ready to go. But he doesn't say necessarily in 3 days we are leaving. Either way, the king wants to know, what are they looking for and why? Now, this is where we need to, I think, just take a pause, because there's no indication here that the king wanted to kill them. Now, I understand the spies not wanting to get caught, but why would the king want to? Why would he want to kill them? To me, everything indicates that he wanted to have a conversation, that there was some sort of ability to negotiate, to come to terms. Like, if you guys want to move across to this side of the river, let's figure out how to do life together. You got a 500-year history of the Canaanites alone. You got thousands of years of a city that's been in existence. And I see no aggression on the part of the Canaanites. There's no indication that they were doing any sort of raiding parties across the river. There's no indication that they were trying to force the Hebrews to worship their idols. There's no provocation for war. And if nothing else, I'm sure that's something the king wants to bring up. Hey, can you go back and tell Joshua, we're not looking to fight. We're not looking to do battle. Our armies are not, preparing for siege. Yes, we have guards along the wall. Of course we do. We have gates we have to guard. We have to keep an eye out for all kinds of shenanigans that can happen. But you're a large nation. We're a large nation. Let's work this out. I really believe that's true. There's even secular writings. There's nothing that indicates the Canaanites were trying to pick a battle with Israel. And this is why when you read about Joshua in the history books, not the Bible, but they see Joshua as a bloodthirsty dictator with a nation of religious zealots. And I can't shake that out of my filter now, because that's exactly what Joshua looks like. We look at the vows that the people took before they started this whole campaign. They were like, Joshua, you're our leader. Joshua, you're our teacher. You talk to God. God tells you what we're supposed to do. We do what you tell us to do. We will follow you. We will obey you. And if we don't obey you, we want to be put to death. That's a zealot. And they're doing this all in the name of God. And this would have been quite clear. If you had any conversation with the Hebrew about why they were going to go into the promised land, they'd be like, because God is giving it to us. God has told us it's ours. We will, kill, steal, and destroy until it's ours, because it's God promised it to us. So in the name of God, they're doing exactly what their leader tells them to do, which means Joshua looks like a dictator with a nation of religious zealots that are willing to die in the name of their God in order to destroy, kill, steal, and destroy everything in the nation, in the land that they call the promised land in Canaan. Now, Rahab would have been, very aware of all of this because of the type of, she runs a hotel. And yes, there might be prostitutes in and out of it. She might have been one formerly. We don't know. There's a lot of innuendos and a lot of possibilities for conversation around what all was going on there. But she would have been aware and possibly might have even seen the nation and the army gathering on the shoreline from her vantage point in the, as a hotel owner in the walls of the city. Boats would ferry people back and forth. They would talk about the nation. They would talk about an army, developing. They would, how are they all going to get across? Are they building boats? I mean, that would have been the logical thing, right? They probably weren't considering the fact that these guys were moving anytime soon, because they didn't see 1,000 boats starting to be built and placed along the shoreline, or rafts, or whatever you would call it, or like there didn't seem to be any preparation for coming across the river, at least right there at Jericho. So they would have probably thought, well, maybe they'll work their way across the, some other place, some of the shallows. Boat drivers, merchants would have spread information about to the city guards, but also, they would have spread that information to the innkeeper. They would have told Rahab. Rahab, I'm sure, was friends with a lot of people. Now, Rahab was the head of her household, which is an interesting thing. Now, whether she forged a career, without a husband or after her husband, she lived literally on the edge of town. She had a wall dwelling. And wall dwellings were common in that time. And often they were hotels or even bunk rooms for guards. So Jericho, not just Jericho, any walled city they would put guards along the top of the wall, and in the wall they would put places for them to, in essence, sleep. So while you were on duty, you'd have a bunkhouse, or you'd have a hotel that was under contract with the king in the city, and then they would provide you food and a place to sleep, and then when you were off duty, you'd switch, like that sort of thing, in various forms. The concept, is fairly obvious, I think. So that's the type of housing that Rahab probably managed. That was her career. Were there prostitutes in there? Probably. Now, whether it was they were run by Rahab or they were just brought in by the guards, and Rahab knew that it was going on, it didn't. Sometimes she's called Rahab the harlot. Sometimes she's just called Rahab the innkeeper. The word is, it has the ability to be either, and potentially both. And that's what I guess I land. It's probably both. So Jericho had two walls. Now, they had an inner wall that was built when the city was smaller. And then as the city expanded, eventually they decided to put a wall out there as well. They wanted to expand the city, so they pushed the wall out. And again, this comes from various digs, archaeological digs and that sort of thing, but most people believe, because it's noted, in Scripture, that the walls of Jericho were wide enough for chariots to race on. And we always think that those are kind of monolithic blocks of stone, but archaeologically we don't find those type of stones in and around Jericho. So what we see is that when they expanded, they basically built like a large retention wall. So there was a separate wall built, and it was filled in, and in between now the two walls is where the city expanded. So now you have the outer wall, and you have this large dirt area that people could farm, people could build houses, and now you have a secondary wall that is almost like a retention wall. And that's now the expanded wall. So the walls being wide enough for chariots to race in would have been that middle section where, in essence, it's filled with dirt and landfill or whatever, where they built it up a little bit, leveled it. That would have been that whole section from the first wall to the second wall would have been considered the walls of Jericho. And yes, chariots could race in that area, and maybe they did. Maybe they had a center street that was wide enough, and I can totally see how people would do horse racing and chariot racing and foot. Who knows? And maybe they did like marathons around the city. I don't know. Maybe they had a 6 a.m. walk club like a lot of malls do, and all the retired people would get together, and they would. No, they didn't have retired people back then. That's a total Western society thing. Back then, you just worked, and you when you couldn't work, you worked what you could, and when you couldn't do any more, like you eventually just got to a point where you couldn't move, and then you would die. I guess that's kind of sad. We took a turn, didn't we? At that time, we don't need to be sad. All right. So that outer wall was like this huge, like I said, it was filled with fill. I covered all these notes. And businesses would grow, and the town would expand, and they would expand in the safety of the wall. And that, of course, was how cities would expand. Now, it doesn't mean that people didn't live outside the wall, but often what they put out there, were more like sheds and shacks, things that weren't of great value. They didn't leave things of value outside. Or they were nomads, and they just wanted to live near the city so that they could go in every day and do business. Maybe they had work, or maybe they were harvesters, and they would live outside the city wall, near the fields, so that they could start work early in the day when it was cool before the city gates opened. All that kind of stuff. So there were people. There were a lot of people around. It was a pretty big city, and Rahab would have been somebody who was aware of all the comings and goings, as most innkeepers are. Bartenders are another one, right? I love bartending. Not that I'm a bartender, but I love their job. Like they have that opportunity to talk with everybody. Now, I have little doubt that there are some people they do not want to talk to, and there are people who, in the middle of a massive rush of work, they suddenly want to pour out their life story to you because they've had 2 drinks and now they think everybody loves them, so they just wanted so I'm sure they get frustrated with people as well, and probably Rahab did as well. But she would have known all the things. And the spies come in for food and lodging in this place on the wall. It was out of the way, but it wasn't isolated. There were other businesses around. And the other businesses who would have, come there and stayed there were probably not looking to get to know the other guests that were also staying there. I don't know how often you stay in hotels, but often, right? You can go into the lobby, and what are you generally trying to do? Sit somewhere where nobody else is. And I do this a lot because I get up early, and when we stay in a hotel, which I love doing, we stay in a hotel, I get up early, I go down to the lobby, I find whatever coffee can be found, and sometimes that means I walk to it because the lobby isn't open at 4:30 in the morning. So I'll walk down the street. Generally, hotels are near convenience stores or near something that's open, and I'll figure it out. Anyway, so I get my coffee, I come back, I sit down, and I see people coming down for, let's say, the breakfast or whatever, and they generally try to avoid sitting near one another. Now that's probably an American thing. So in this culture, the spies not really wanting to be known, they would have probably avoided the public areas for as long as they could. Now they wanted food, they probably got some food, they probably made small talk. They were there. Remember, they also had to kind of get the feel of the land. They kind of had to get an idea of, is the city preparing for battle? Are there soldiers in the street? Are the battlements being propped up? Is there more armor and ammunition being stocked along the edge of the wall? But again, there's no indication in Scripture that any of that was going on. We'll get into it next week, probably more so, but they would have wanted to just get a sense of what was going on without necessarily being questioned themselves. So they probably wanted to remain somewhat anonymous. But Rahab would have seen these guys. She would have known that they were from the Hebrew nation across the river. She would have known that they weren't, they didn't bring any prostitutes with them. So they met Rahab, and they get a room, and they're trying to kind of stay low key. But they also want information. So I have a feeling they're talking with Rahab. And she's pouring out information. But she's also gaining information. And what she's gaining will greatly impact what she does for them later on that evening. And you know what? It's been almost 30 minutes. We're not gonna get through the rest of this, are we? Bob's like, please don't. My main takeaway from this week is this, and I'll go back to it, is that all indications are that Jericho had no desire for battle. They were prepared for it because they always are. They were a walled city. But they had no desire for battle. They did nothing to provocate or provoke a war, let alone a battle with the Hebrews. And the indication is that the king wanted to talk with the spies. He didn't want to kill them, which to me speaks of negotiation. It speaks of, let's figure this out. If you want to live on this side of the river, obviously Jericho is going to be a part of your life. So let's figure this out. And all of that, again, I know I come to these stories with a pretty clear filter, which is that God looks like Jesus, and Jesus didn't kill, and neither does God. So I don't believe it's God's plan to kill everyone in Jericho. And I believe the spies could have seen that this was an opportunity for conversation and negotiation. But, well, we'll find out what happens next week on The Epic Narrative.
Don't go anywhere. We've got Bob Thoughts.
And welcome back. Yeah, we are 4 episodes in, and we're finally going to get to Jericho. But I was listening again, and I just think so many times we get focused on how we believe the vision is supposed to be accomplished that we miss the opportunity to maybe do it a different way. And I think in this case, the opportunity to do it the way God intended. You know, sometimes you get this happens in much smaller versions, right? You have an opportunity to speak, or you're at a party and you have a story you want to tell because you think it needs to be told, or the entertainment value of it is really high. So you just go ahead and you tell the story, but you don't read the room. And when you're all done, it falls flat. I mean, I've done that a few times, so I'll just tell you that right now. I've told some jokes that should have been hilarious, but I didn't read the room. It was no bueno. I mean, it's funny to think about, but in the moment, it's like, okay, don't know what just happened. Or I hear somebody refer to something in one of their stories, and I think, oh no, I've got it. And I should have just read the room and been like, Bob, no one wants to hear your story. We're super interested in the other guy or the other girl telling the story. But that happens obviously on larger scales as well, and I think it happened here as they head into taking the promised land. The spies were looking for the evidence necessary to justify going in and killing everyone, and they weren't looking for the evidence that was quite clear that nobody in Jericho wanted to go to battle. They were willing to have conversations. They were willing to negotiate. And I know we'll hit it again next week because I think it's a really key point as we evaluate not just Jericho, but the entire book of Joshua. I think they missed it. I don't think, is it sinful? Bob's like, is it sinful? I don't think it's sinful. You just missed it. Is God good? Absolutely. Does his goodness come through? Yep. And we'll see his goodness. But that doesn't mean that God condones what Joshua is about to do to the nation, to the land that God promised them. So when you're doing life and you believe you have a vision for what God wants to accomplish next, then it's really good to be patient and read the room. Those of you that have been following me now, you know we've been on the road for 4 years. And when we left our incredibly well-paying job at a very small church, like honestly, we got paid ridiculous amounts of money considering the size of the church. But when we left it, it was because God invited us to something more. He was like, do you want to go on an adventure with me? Sorry, that was really hard to get out. And we said yes. But we really thought, I especially thought, it would be done in 6 months to a year. And there were opportunities that we could have, in essence, kicked down the door and made happen within that 1 year period. As a matter of fact, one opportunity popped up within a month, I think within 3 weeks of us leaving. And then it reemerged, 6 months or a year late, 8 months. I mean, it was really amazing, but man, I got to thank my wife. She was like, we can't jump at the first thing. But I was so excited. Like, I know God has more, and this was more, and this was opportunity, and this was like not just Not just a small thing like this could impact the nation. This could impact nations. Like we could be known worldwide. This could be huge. Saw the potential, saw the vision. But I agreed with my wife. I really did. I sat back and I was like, yeah, I could make it happen. And God would still be good. But it's not. It's not what he called us to do. So we're waiting. I get excited because I see opportunities popping up. There's one coming, in a few weeks. I'm going to be hanging out with some people, and I think, hey, you know what? One of those people, they could be the key. But I don't know, and I'm willing to wait. So, yeah, read the room. Don't get fixated on how the vision will come out. Currently, those of you who want to know, currently we're living with our daughter and son-in-law. They graciously opened up their guest room and the rest of their house to share, and we are living there. Actually renting that house from our oldest son, who wanted to sell it, but because his sister and brother-in-law needed a place, he was like, all right, well, we'll just rent it to you guys until you guys don't need it, and then we'll sell it. So we're praying blessings on him that, the value of the house will just increase exponentially because of his kindness. And, and that's where we are. We are living with them, and we will see. We will see. Because I still believe in that vision. I still believe God has it. But we just don't know where or when yet. But we will. And you will find out about it right here on the Epic Narrative. Once again, if you can help us out financially, we're trying to raise at least $5,000 to expand our advertising of the Epic Narrative, as well as we want to ultimately get to a visual as well as audio. And that'll involve more than $5,000, but we want to get there, and we need to start building toward that. So if you can help us out, reach out to me at thebobswitzer.com, and I can give you details on how to send it to us via Apple Pay or Zelle or PayPal. And that'll be great. Thanks so much for listening, everyone. I'll see you next week on The Epic Narrative.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe to this podcast on any platform you use. You can also reach out to Bob for questions or booking at thebobswitzer.com or email him at thebobswitzer@gmail.com. See you next week, guys.